Hey up! I want to talk about a motorcycle today that was really influential in my sort of path through motorcycling, the Honda CD200 BENLY. And I want to ask the question as to whether, with the success of the GB350s, Honda should consider reintroducing a version of the BENLY. Now, it's a difficult week for me this week because Paula's in for radiotherapy every day this week, so I'm even shorter on time than I have been for the last few months. The other issue is as well, getting images of this bike that are copyright compatible for YouTube. I've got very few images. The good news is the 200 BENLY, which has now reached classic status, has sort of experienced a bit of a resurgence in interest over the last few years, and there are quite a few channels now that are specialising in restorations or just, you know, general sort of lifestyle videos with 200 BENLYs. I'll pick a couple out and I'll leave a link in the video description down below so that when you've watched this video, if you want to get a better idea of what these bikes are about, you can click onto those videos and watch them. Now, Honda were the very first motorcycle company to come up with the idea of a modern classic motorcycle with the GB500 back in 1984. This bike was basically a celebration of the golden era of British-built motorcycles back in the 1950s and the 1960s. The problem was the world wasn't quite ready for the concept of a modern classic at that stage. It wasn't a huge success and eventually it faded into obscurity. The popular motorcycle press at the time was still chasing bikes based on their performance figures, and it just didn't seem to fit in with the general mood of the time. Now, I might be wrong, but I always got the feeling that Honda had got the fingers bent with the GB500, and they never attempted anything like that again for decades. Until quite recently. Now, the modern classic scene has been steadily growing for the last 20 years. Triumph with their Bonneville models. Of course, Royal Enfield has always been around with the bullet-derived models. Although it's got to be said, because of the unique circumstances under which Royal Enfield survived, they've only recently, in the last 5 or 6 years, actually started building true modern classics. Now, the other thing that's been gradually happening over, let's say, the last 10 years, since about 2016, is that attitudes towards motorcycles have changed. Power's no longer king. We've got speed cameras everywhere, lower speed limits than we've ever seen before. High-powered bikes are becoming less and less relevant with every passing year, and a lot of motorcyclists' attentions have turned to modestly powered bikes that have style. As a result of this sort of changing climate in motorcycle sales, Honda last year decided to introduce the GB350 across Europe and the UK, and I think it's safe to say that the GB350s has been a runaway success. They sold out in the middle of 2025, and it looks like we're going to have a repeat of that this year in 2026, with huge waiting lists for this bike, with even second-hand models changing hands for not much less than the recommended retail price of new. Now, Honda Motorcycles is the biggest motorcycle company in the world. You know, they turn out something like 20 million motorcycles a year, and the secret of their success is not the big high-powered motorcycles as a lot of people presume they are. The secret of their success is the high volume turnout of modestly powered commuter motorcycles, a segment that other manufacturers, I wouldn't say they ignore, but they don't put as much emphasis on it when it comes to production. I mean, I can't actually remember the numbers involved, but the humble Honda Cub is the biggest selling motorcycle of all time. And let's face it, that's about as humble and modestly powered as it gets. Now, of course, the other occurrence that has made modern classics more sort of popular is the advent of emissions controls for motorcycles, which started mainly in 2016, with restrictions continuing to be loaded on motorcycles until Euro 5 Plus, which was introduced last year and requires real-time monitoring of the emissions from the engine. This means a lot of manufacturers have actually had to can some of the high-powered motorcycle production because they're just not capable of getting them through the emissions controls. And it's important to take that into consideration, because there isn't a day goes by when I don't get somebody with a comment that's had the head stuck in a bucket of sand for the last 10 years that simply doesn't understand what's going on. Now, it seems to me that the runaway success of the Honda GB350s in the UK and Europe has got to have got Honda thinking about this subject and what else they can do. Now, we know that there's a GB500s trademark being registered for the UK, Europe and I think America, but we don't know when that's going to appear. But personally, and this is just my view, I think they should pay attention to the Honda CD200 BENLY craze that seems to be currently going on. Now, these bikes are being found in barns, they're changing hands from previous owners to new owners, they're being restored, they're being just put back into running order and put back into service. They are an outstanding, tough, durable motorcycle with unmistakable classic lines. Now, the first BENLY, I believe, was brought out in 1959. It developed over the years until the 1970s, and then I think development of this bike more or less stopped. As I say, everybody was concentrated on big, high-powered motorcycles by then, but there were some bikes that just had an inherent value to customers, especially as a commuter. And despite them being, by the standards of the times, very underpowered and outdated, some manufacturers kept them in their lineup of motorcycles because they were just still good sellers. And one of those was the Honda CD200 BENLY. Now, the 200 BENLY continued to be available new right into the early 1980s, and I actually owned one in the early 1990s. A gorgeous light metallic blue version, just like this, but blue. Now, in the early 1990s, I was going through a bit of a bad patch. I was driving around on a Yamaha XS250, using it as a general commuter for work and such like, but there was a mate of mine at work that was lusting after it. He was constantly asking me if I would sell it to him. And eventually, I came across this BENLY for £100, and he was offering me £250 for the Yamaha, so I snapped his hand off and got the BENLY. Now, on paper, the BENLY was nothing to shout home about, especially at that time. It was a very simple, oil-cooled 194cc parallel twin engine, which had been seriously detuned for economy. I think it struggled to put out 16 horsepower at the crank, with a top speed, if you were lucky, of about 70 miles an hour and a realistic cruising speed of about 60. Now, in the UK and Europe, it was known as the CD200 BENLY, but it was available in other territories like Asia and Africa, where it was known as the CD200 Roadmaster. And it gave, realistic road performance, sort of married up to 100 mpg fuel efficiency in a traditional roadster configuration. Steel shrouded front forks, just like they had back in the old days. A very convenient choke knob that was situated centrally on the handlebars. Just a speedometer, no rev counter. Traditional rear shocks in an era where monoshock was becoming a thing. Traditional spoked wire wheels and a fully enclosed chain guard, which made chain maintenance almost obsolete. It protected the chain so well that you barely ever had to touch it. It was capable of travelling several thousand miles between chain lubrication sessions, although I do remember it was a bit of a challenge getting the chain case off. It had simple cable operated drum brakes front and rear, but they did work. And it achieved legendary status as a bulletproof, bomb-proof and idiot-proof commuter that was simple and easy and cheap to maintain, with a luxurious, deeply upholstered seat that was comfortable for mile after mile. It could easily keep up with other traffic on the roads, but performance wasn't its strength. Its strength was its ease of use, its uncompromising reliability, and the sheer convenience in use. In essence, it was a grown-up version of the Cub. Maximum power was developed at about 8,500 revs. It was quite a busy engine, but it was silky smooth, and that was common for that era. It was a very simple chassis with a single beam engine cradle, very similar to the current GB350. Now, I had that bike for about 2.5 years, and I used it daily for work, winter and summer. And during that time, I carried out what I would call an oily rag restoration. It wasn't a complete restoration. I just went through the bike nut by bolt, cleaning parts, polishing parts, adjusting parts, tidying up the electrics, and correcting faults, general servicing, so that it was in peak running order. It never failed at MOT, even though it was about 10 years old and it had clearly spent most of its life living outside. And looking back, that bike provided me with some of the most enjoyable, carefree motorcycling of my motorcycling career. In fact, it was that bike that sort of brought me onto the Honda GB350s. It reminds me so much of that old Bentley. The GB350 has a very similar character. Now, I can't actually remember why or how I parted with the Bentley, but what I do know is that getting rid of the bike has been one of my life's biggest regrets. I so wish that I still had it. And in a way, having the GB350s has sort of made that worse, because it's just such a big reminder of the time that I had with that bike. And as the modern classic segment of motorcycling continues to grow as each year rolls on, I can't help wondering, wouldn't it be fantastic if Honda could reintroduce a Bentley model into their modern classic range? Now, not a 200, I think it would have to be at least a 350, maybe even a 400 or a 500, with a super smooth twin-cylinder engine that's tuned for torque rather than horsepower, built into a classically designed motorcycle with all the traits of that old Bentley. I would buy one in a heartbeat. And if Honda seriously wants to exploit its own heritage in the modern classic segment, it seems to me to be the perfect place to start. Let me know what you think. Now, a fully restored Honda Bentley, and they are available, sells for around about £5,000, but you can buy, not a basket case, but a complete non-runner for around about £500 still. And it seems that there is a growing interest in this market if you just take a little bit of time on Google to explore it. And it's not just a UK or European thing, there's healthy interest with the Roadmaster in Asia and Africa. It may just be wishful thinking on my part, but I think that there is a lot of life left in the Bentley name as it stands at the moment, something that Honda should maybe look at exploiting. Right, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. I'd also appreciate it if you would leave a like, hype this video if the hype button is available to you, and consider becoming a subscriber to this channel if you haven't already done so. You can help me out in other ways via my Patreon page, PayPal donations, details of which will be in the video description down below, along with the links to those videos. Or you can use the super thanks button just below the picture that you're watching now. Either way, it's much appreciated. I will of course be back on Friday, so until then, please ride safely, and I'll see you soon.